Hello, this is a new virtual instrument from IK Multimedia. It's called MODO Bass, and it's a departure from IK Multimedia's usual productions. You'll probably know IK Multimedia for their guitar amp processors and bass processors, and they do a very good series of plugins, custom rack plugins for looking at guitar processing and amp simulators. And you'll also know them for their sample playback engine, and they've had some success with that. This is something very different. This is actually a modelled guitar. You've probably seen or heard of instruments like piano tech, which are modelled pianos. And what IK Multimedia have done here is they've cleverly modelled a number of bass guitars, actually using resonance and string modeling to try and get the sound of a authentic bass guitar. But they haven't just done one bass guitar, they've done lots of bass guitars. You can see on the top of the window here, they've got a 60s pop bass, 70s jazz bass, modern jazz bass, a thing called a devil bass, a bassman, a Ricken bass, you can probably guess what that one's trying to be, a studio bass, a violin bass, a thunder bass, a Japan bass, and a flame bass, and they're all different types of bass guitar used in contemporary and kind of authentic pop music. So what we've got is quite a complicated GUI here. For a start, you've got a picture of the bass you've selected, and if you select different basses, the picture of your bass change. That's kind of really just a clever little GUI, but really doesn't serve very much purpose other than just looking pretty. Underneath there, you've got a menu where you can choose between models, playing style, we'll come to that in a second, the type of strings you're using and how many of them you've got, the electronics, so the pickups of the guitar itself. You can select which pickup you want to use and you can move your pickups around. You can then use virtual modeling to look at various amps, and you've got a choice between a couple of amps. And then finally you've got the MIDI control on the end. So let's very briefly go through some of the basses, have a little play, and just see what this sounds like. So this is the 60s pop bass, and I've left all the settings on default, but what we'll do is when we've played a few of them, we'll go and choose a single bass and then play around with some of the settings. So this is the 60s pop bass. So that's not a bad sounding bass. Sounds quite crisp. It's got a nice pull off when you release the note as well. It doesn't sustain, which is good for a bass guitar. Nothing worse than having a sustaining bass guitar. So it doesn't respond to the sustain pedal. You just have to hold the key for as long as you want to play for, and then by releasing the key, you're assuming that the player is releasing the string or the fret. You can also mute your bass. There's a key up at the top here, which is E5. And if I hit E5, you can hear it plays a nice little mute. So if I play a bass line, that same line, I've got a nice little mute there, so I can actually stop the bass sounding. So it's getting some quite nice effects there. This is the 70s pop bass. Each of these basses is designed to be monophonic, but it allows you to play polyphonic. So for instance, in this bass, I can play some polyphonic notes using the 4 different strings. So that's actually quite clever as well, and you'll notice in the little fretboard diagram down the bottom, it's showing you which strings you're playing with which note, which is nice. It has a legato function, so if you're on the same string and you try and go up a few notes, as I'm just about to do now, you can see there it allows me to do a minor second legato. So it's a major second, sorry. But it won't allow me to go up a further note. It actually goes on to the next string, which is really great. So you can do those little pull on and pull offs. And also play some multi-note harmonies, which is really quite handy. Okay, so the 70s jazz bass. So you can see it's got a much richer tone, and the modern jazz bass is very similar. It's velocity sensitive, so if you hit it really hard, it gives you a bit more of a thump, and hit it nice and gently, you can get some nice subtle tones. Moving on, we've got Devil Bass, which is a single pickup, kind of 60s bass. Much more kind of woody, middly tone with more bass and much less treble on the strings there. A good old Bassman 5-string. Which is quite nice as well. It's kind of interesting that they've put a 5-string in here, because I'll show you in a minute, you can actually have as many strings as you like. Well, 4 or 5. So you can choose each bass to have a different number of strings, which is quite nice. Then you've got the Ricken bass. A studio bass, multi-pickup studio bass. That's actually the bass I've been using most of all in my recent work. And then the violin bass, you'll notice this is something very similar to our friend Paul McCartney's bass. So that's got a very, very nice noticeable tone there. Thunder bass is going down the rock way. And then the Japan bass and the flame bass are also for rock and metal. And the flame bass. Again, a nice trebly with lots of attack on that bass. So let's just go back to studio bass and have a look at the various settings. You'll see down the side here it says for specifications of each of the basses. It tells you how many strings it's got, whether they're wound in which way, the scale, the frets, the circuitry, and these are the basic settings that you can now set using all of these controls at the top. So our first thing we can look at is we can look at the picking position, or in this case the fingering position, and you can see it's 7.88 inches from the board here, and you can move that up and down. If you move it closer or further away, or somewhere in between. You can see it changes the tone as it would do if you are fretting your bass in a different, or plucking your bass in a different place. The great thing is you can automate this, so you can MIDI learn this command, or you can type in the exact distance yourself, which is really great. So you can actually move up and down the bass as you're playing it. In the playing style window, you can choose between fingered, picked or slapped, and you can also choose these using these black keys down the bottom here. So it's F sharp, G sharp and A sharp naught, which you can select here. So you've got finger, pick and slap, and with the finger and the pick you can choose different pick positions, and it'll remember where you left them, so I can switch between fingered and pick here. But the slap, of course, is just slapped randomly where you want to slap it. So the finger sounds obviously as if you'd expect it to be plucked with the finger. picked is with a plastic pick. It's a shame you can't choose whether it's a plastic pick or a ebony pick or whatever, but anyway, it's just a pick. And then finally slap. Which is a nice little slap guitar sound. So that's the picking style. You've then got a mute button here, so you can choose the level of bridge muting. So turn it right up. And these are all controllable as well from MIDI, so you can have this assigned, as I have here, to a slider. And play various melodies containing mutes. The stroke control is either indexed middle finger or alternate index and middle finger. It doesn't make a huge difference to the sound, so I'm going to leave that where it is. The touch you can have as a soft, hard, or normal touch, and that's essentially the velocity response as well as the way that the strings respond to the different velocities. And if you are doing kind of rock bass where you want the bass to continue sustaining when you've played your note, you can leave the let ring on, and now you can let it ring. Fingering, you can choose between first position, easy, nearest. First position tries to keep it down in the bottom of the guitar here, as with the red section you can see. Easy is just simply it does it all for you, and nearest is basically choose the nearest note for the nearest string. So you can see there I'm playing B flat, C and D, and when I'm doing nearest, it's doing a legato up that single string there. If I choose first position, it does the same, and with easy, it does the same. So for some distances, it makes no difference at all. So don't worry too much about the fingering. Open strings you can either turn on or off, and it'll either will or won't play an open string. Obviously open strings you can't do vibrato on them, and you can't do a roll into it or a bend on it. So if you don't want to have open strings, you can turn that off. And then finally here you've got the noises. So the detached noise, which is the finger off the string noise. Have as loud as you like, or you can have it nice and quiet. Somewhere around about 3 seems about the right place. And the slide noise, we'll come to the slides in a second, but the slide noise allows you to change the sound of the frets when you're sliding. On the string setting, you can choose how many strings you've got. So in this case, you've got 4 with a drop D, 5 or 4, and you can see the graphics change as you change your string. I'll leave it on 5. And the action you can set as being a high action, a low action, or a standard action. So on a standard action, you can do quite controlled pitches and frets. On a high action, the same. On the low action, you run more risk of getting little rings and buzzes because you're closer, of course, to the frets, and therefore when the strings vibrate, they have the chance of hitting them. So they've modelled all that, and that's actually quite nice. If you're playing kind of a loose jazz, you may want to leave it on slow and get a little bit more influence from the frets. So I'm going to leave that on standard. You can then choose what kind of string you've got. You've got flat wound, round wound. So we'll leave that on round wound for the moment. You can choose what gauge. You've got medium, heavy, or light. And you've got how old your strings are too. Old strings, new strings, and broken in strings. So obviously this will change the way the pitch control works on the frets, depending on how good the strings are. So the intonation on fretboards and guitars is very subjective, really, depending on how old the strings, whether they're being pre-stretched, broken in, rubbed down, whatever. So you can choose that, and it'll be very subtle. but leave it on broken in just for the ease of this. And then down the end here you've got the standard pitch A4 reference, so you can choose to change the pitch of this instrument if you're using differently tuned instruments alongside it, which is quite nice. Okay, so the electronics section allows you to choose which kind of pickups you've got. Clearly, the bass guitar models that you choose have their own pickups, and so we've chosen here the studio pickups because that's what this guitar is. But if you wanted to, you could go and choose a, let's find a violin bass close pickup and then keep the studio basses, and you can either disable them by clicking on them. No sound with no pickup. And then you can mix between the two. Which is quite nice. You've also got a piezo pickup, which you can turn up or down. You can then choose between active or passive circuits. Of course, the active circuit will give you an EQ. Passive surface just simply gives you a tone knob. So it depends on what you're after. Controls the tone, and with the active pickup, you've got control over bass, middle, and treble. There are no frequencies involved here. It's just what you'd expect on a bass guitar. Some bass roll-off or some treble gain or roll-off. So got some quite nice control within the interface. You may not have to use any EQ in your digital audio workstation after you've done some recording. If you've been fiddling with this and you've modified all these settings and you're now really confused where you're at, you can click on Reset Bass to Default. And you can see here it's reset all the settings on all the pages to the default settings, which is really quite handy, just to put things back to where they were before you started playing around with it. So then we'll move on to the amp and effects. You've got a choice of amps, either a tube or a solid state amp. When you change the amps, the little pretty pictures change, and you can see this one is currently the highlighted amp, and if you choose solid state, you'll see the solid state amp appears here. These are generic amps from the IK Multimedia modeled amp collection, and with the tube amps you've got a selection of various pedals. So here we've got the tube amp with a speaker. If we go to the pedals, we've got a compressor, an EQ, an octaver. So if you go to the compressor, you've got various choices as well for each one, but we're going to choose the compressor and we can add some compression. And you can see the gain reduction in here. The great thing is, of course, this is all done virtually. It's a virtual instrument and this is all modeled, but it models the compressor clearly before it reaches the amp. So you can actually do some quite nice modeling. So it's not like having an amped guitar you're then putting through a compressor, which is great. The envelope filter is quite nice for doing filter sweeps and various changes there. And the octaver, of course, allows you to add an octave, and you can turn it on and off either by clicking on the little button on the front here or clicking on the pedal itself. And there we are. There's the extra octave there. The filter's actually quite fun. You can which is great. You probably noticed also on here you have got some distortion. So if you are after that lovely distorted bass sound, you can shove the drive up. Of course, we've also got some compression on there, so we'll turn that off. Which is great to get some distortion. If you choose the solid state amp, you've got exactly the same choice of pedals, and you've also got a graphic EQ to go with the amp. You'll notice here you can't choose your speaker. Your speaker is what you have. So this is a 2x2 speaker, and this is a single speaker that goes with it, so you can't have a various cab emulation. But what you can do, of course, if you're feeling that way inclined, you can fade off the master control for the amp. Let's get rid of that distortion. There we go. And now all we've got is the DI, the direct inject, coming out, and you can then put that through your guitar amp processor within your DAW and use your different cab settings. So it's rather like having a bass guitar emulator with one of the IK Multimedia kind of light edition amp sims with it. But to be honest, they seem to serve the purpose very well. Last but by no means least is the MIDI control. So it shows you a nice graphic here. It's very pretty. They could have just listed them, but it's quite nice to have the graphic. As I said, you can select here between finger, picked, and slap. And if you look down here, you can also, depending on what mode you're in, you can choose between an index stroke or middle finger stroke, an upstroke and a downstroke with picks, or a slap and a pull. This is actually quite hard to get your head around, but if I just hit the slap button and then the pull button, you've got some control over those things. And the same with the pick. You can do an up-down stroke, so which is kind of fun. And you've got the ghost note down the bottom there, which is right at the bottom of this keyboard. A lot of bass guitar simulators have that ghost note as a very low velocity note, but they don't do that on here. You've also then got controls of the let ring function using A-1. You can force everything to be on a B string, in this case the low B string. You've got the hammer on and pull off depending on which way you're playing. You can force that. You can then force the D string, force the E string, and then of course you've got harmonics. A lot of bass, again, virtual instruments will give you a harmonics patch, which will play up 2 or 3 octaves higher, of course, because they're harmonics, and it'll play them at pitch on the keyboard. The harmonics section of this instrument still stick within the bass range, so you just have to remember that when you're playing, it's going to play the harmonics at the same note range that the bass guitar plays. And then beyond that, you've got forcing the G or forcing the A string. So the last thing I just wanted to go through and just show off with this, because I think it's a very clever way of doing it, is you've also got a slide control. So obviously with bass guitars, it's nice to be able to slide between notes, and you could do it chromatically, so you can go from a and slide up like that. It's a bit messy, it's quite hard to do. They've actually integrated it into the pitch bend lever or into the sustain pedal. So if I go to the control section here, you'll see at the moment I've got slide set to pitch wheel with a range of 24. If I change that range down to 4 and then use the pitch bend, you'll hear which is really nice control. If you set that just to 1, you could do some really nice little trills, which is actually better than playing the 2 notes next to each other, because some notes it'll force you to change strings. Of course, you could force the E string in this case and do a trill that way, or you could use the pitch bend lever, which is, I think, is a very clever idea. If you set the range to 24, you could do some really nice glides. So that's really quite handy. You could actually set this range to 24, which is quite bonkers, and do some really long slides like that, which is really great. If you don't want to use a pitch bend, because you may want to use a pitch wheel for pitch, you can turn the slide on and off using CC24. So I can hit the sustain pedal and it will slide up for me. The harder I hit the second note, the faster the slide, and conversely, the slower, the slower. So I'll play a C, does a nice slow slide up, hit it harder, it goes a lot quicker. So that's another really useful thing. It's not quite as dynamic, you can't kind of go, it's very hard to do that kind of run up and down at the right speed. You could use a pitch bend control for that, but that's a really kind of handy way of playing the bass guitar in this case. And you could automatically turn on and off the chord control. So that is MODO Bass. It's received a little bit of criticism from some people saying it doesn't sound very much like a bass guitar. I would disagree. I think it sounds actually pretty convincing. I think you've got a lot of choice for sculpting your sound and making it what you will. And I think this is a good addition to anyone's arsenal. If you're wondering how much CPU it's using up, on my MacBook Pro, which is an i7 quad-core, it's using up about 5% of the total CPU power within Cubase. It will work in other digital audio workstations. It's just a VST plugin, a 64-bit VST plugin. So it is compatible with the Cubase version 9. But I think it's very, very good. I think you've got some really good opportunities for sculpting bass sounds, and I should recommend it to anybody.